1977 in China, and very knowledgeable. She actually was on the helm of affairs when Pakistan was going through crisis of floods in Pakistan, and she did represented the vulnerable population to the world from Pakistan. So may we request ma'am to give a keynote speech, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Ms. Vidyaramani. Thank you very much to SDPI and the partners. I think this is your panel only, right? Okay, so I just want to speak very briefly because I have to be somewhere else. And the 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 headline for me on climate financing is obviously it's the piece that can make things happen. If you bridge the gaps in financing, well, magically adaptation will happen, mitigation will start turning a page, and we will actually have something credible to fund the loss and to capitalize the loss and damage fund. Now, I'm sure there are technical experts here to talk about how to actually unlock climate financing for countries that are in debt stress, because that's where we are today. If you are in debt stress, let's not talk in vacuums and in a kind of strategic PowerPoint format. Let's just think this through. Pakistan is a country that is in debt. There are many, like I think 78% of its GDP is spent on that. And then you have many countries now that are drowning in much higher percentage, whether they're the SIDS or the less developed countries. We're not in the less developed category, but here's how that works. If we connect together, create kind of a consensus on the fact that the Bridgetown Initiative and other such proposals have a way to change the meaning or the game in terms of climate financing, how it flows, then the whole business of unpacking climate financing becomes meaningful. Right now, the trend seems to be from the last year's COP, totally impressionistically, to drive developing countries with a huge astronomical gap in adaptation financing. And I'm saying adaptation financing because that's the need and that's the Cinderella slot, after midnight discussion at COPs. So how do countries that are facing disasters or sea level rise or other warming aftershocks survive, and how do they access climate financing? Because that's the buzzword. Everybody says that if you get the financing, you will be able to complete the loop in better governance and sort of lifting people out of climate poverty, migration, and other destitutions that are forced on them by climate losses, induced losses. Now, I'm not going to keep talking about the flood that defined our experience and taught us some lessons. The French are, as usual, impinging on my ears, so I'm going to raise my voice. What I think we need to do is understand that we have been talking about global uh, international financing, that is public financing, and that's gone from billions into trillions, both for adaptation and mitigation financing. Now, while the COPs were running, it went from millions and billions. Now it's comfortably into trillions that are from nowhere being capitalized in the many funds that have been created, including the loss and damage fund. Yes, I'm personally attached to the fund because we put a lot of blood guts and late nights into it. But the point is, it will need a lot more money and agreement on what triggers the fund, who capitalizes it, and where it goes from here. So, in multilateral wrangling may be frustrating, but it's the only thing standing between us and certain peril. Okay, so I think investing in multilateralism is a necessary good. May want to call it a necessary evil. I call it necessary good, and because that's the only place you will be able to find the room and the space to talk about what actually should be the kind of financing you're talking about. And we've been told since public financing internationally is inconvenient or insufficient to meet the kind of climate gaps we are facing in financing, then the mantra from last year has been blended finance as well as accessing private finance, and that includes carbon markets. All three have their limits. Carbon markets will only mobilize so much money, especially for forestry or that maybe for waste management and other emissions. But they have their limits. They are, I mean, Pakistan is already trading in them. And the point is, projects have a time scale, say some are for 30 years, some are for 40. That's it. You've locked in, you've taken what you could from it. Yes, you're regenerating growth of, say, forests, mangroves, whatever it is you are sequestering and taking the offsets from. But that has its limits, right? It is not unlimited, and it will unlock another irritant, but seems to be the phrase, the buzzword of many years, is that it's going to change the game. No, no, carbon markets are not going to change the game. They will make some dents in the huge yawning gap countries face. For argument's sake, let me give you Pakistan's needs till 2030, $348 billion. Which carbon market is going to unlock that? It will be very good to to have regenerative projects that plow back into the green economy and green jobs and forestation and waste management and lowering of industrial emissions. But that's it. It's not transformational. What are you hearing everywhere? We need a transformational COP. Are you seeing, seriously telling me this climate financing is going to be transformational if we unlock climate financing from the private sector? Which private sector is coming to rushing to the front lines of disaster countries? You tell me. Name me three. They're not. They don't. That's what private capital is like. So you hear, and I'm sure you need to unlock it. I think you have to have cogent conversation. So we keep hearing about de-risking it. Now everybody wants to de-risk even their garden. I'm seeing de-risking everywhere. That's this year's buzzword. Well, I mean, insurance and reinsurance, okay, but who is moving the equity, the risk guarantees, the sovereign and non sovereign movers to come into a blended finance fund which is put together with great agility and focus and great capacity to do so? I mean, where this is some kind of magic mantra. I'm sorry to be dismissive of great efforts being made on this front. Please continue to make them. You may be able to unlock great the transformational amounts needed. But I mean, I asked in the last session, why are we even unlocking capital? Why is it locked? Why is it so hard to access public green capital finance, green financing internationally, as well as private financing? Private financing fairly notoriously comes to where they see returns. They're not, I mean, philanthropy is a separate issue, but private investments come where they see returns, they see long term regrowth, and they want guarantees, they want their capital protected, they want their risk insured. And in a climate stress environment where predictability is the last thing on the table, exactly where are you going to see that? I know climate smart investments in medium sized projects are the new buzzword. Okay, good. I hope they come to us, and please design them better. But really don't expect countries in deep debt, climate, and other governance distress to be designing bankable projects. Excuse me, bankable projects in a country where a PC1 holds you down. PC1 is the Planning Commission's frontline document for it's a project document for taking a project forward. It's onerous to negotiate and navigate. Those are critiques of our own governance process. But this is the reality. When half the world is told to access and unlock climate financing by creating bankable projects when they're in a desertification crisis, when they don't have water anymore, when they're about to be water scarce, when they're warming madly, what do? You tell them create bankable projects. I mean, they can barely create a PowerPoint for crying out loud about what their project is. I've seen many. And then the consultants fly in, they take the money. They take the money. The grant is for the consultant to create the bankable project which just lies around. All the SUVs have been bought, the cars have been bought, and that's how it works. A report comes out, some actually get moving, but this is not the formula. Please do not tell developing countries with a serious humanitarian and climate crisis on their heads to create bankable projects and then compete internationally. Say, compete with Germany. I mean, how are you going to win that project? There will be companies with much sharper aligned projects and plans with international TORs. They will land the money, which is why most of the green financing internationally is going A to mitigation projects, not to adaptation financing, which is needed by obviously vulnerable countries, and B, it's going to the north. So, let's just call a spade a spade. And climate financing. I don't know what's happening here. Climate financing is the actual bridge to survival for many of these countries. But so is capacity and technology. So are the untangling of sub-regional and regional government, subnational government governance problems. uh, they are very much there. They haven't gone away, and you can say that, well, XYZ country needs structural reforms. Please, let's not chicken and egg this. Don't say that you need structural reforms, which often tax the poor, but the MDBs insist no, it taxes the elites. It does not. The elites everywhere in the world, newsflash, have a way of evading their taxes everywhere in the world. The 1% here is able to do that. And if you want to talk about climate financing, most countries now from 2011 to 2020 to 2030, 2020 have been counting their development assistance as financing, which used to go to gender programs, which used to go to vulnerable communities, which used to go to normal development programs. That is now all what was known as ODA is now all counted as green financing when it is not. Green financing is the 0.07 guaranteed above and additional to the public financing committed to at the various COPs. So, there's no such thing as a bad COP, but there will be one day if the real issues continue to be skirted around. And that's the issue. Where is the additional financing that has been committed? In a survey by Care International, it just came out a few days ago. Good for them. They survey poverty and vulnerability. Only 7 countries came out as actually having delivered on their commitments for green financing. The rest were hiding it. I mean, creative auditing rules the world, just like litigation. And they were hiding it under the numbers, and they continue to do so. It's all been repurposed to look like green financing. It's good old fashioned ODA. And so that's what countries are asking for. Only 7 countries out of I don't know how many rich countries are now doing that, are actually providing. So there isn't that money. And so really it's not my job coming from a real, what is known as a Shakespearean, everybody's read Shakespeare. You've heard the term blasted heath? Blasted heath? Well, blasted heath is a terrain that's completely destroyed by, say, a meteor or something. If you've seen countries that are actually facing climate catastrophe, the ground often looks like a blasted heath. we are repurposing all money to go to the survivors of that blasted heat. The survivors, so for instance, money that goes for risk alert, Met Office risk alert, millions of dollars sent to Pakistan for that in the form of loans, not grants, are repurposed for saving lives. They go to the social protection program, which delivers the money at the doorstep of, say, the 33 million impacted by the last flood. So, I mean, look, this is the reality. You're telling us go and unlock the money, create bankable projects, compete internationally. Okay, if you can't do that, now let's talk about private financing. Private financing is carrying on with 7.2 trillion in subsidies to oil and gas as we sit here pretending it's not. That's what actually private capital is doing. It's not coming to the blasted heath. It will come, yes, it will. So will the other public, it will come as small projects. They will come as teeny weeny projects for a few districts, which will then allow everyone to tick the box. We have done a green Pakistan or clean Pakistan or gender responsive Pakistan climate project. We've done it. It's gone to three districts. So, scale and capital that has to be ensured. I don't see it happening from the public sector internationally. You can see what's going on in front of you. Loss and damage is barely reaching a billion, and I'm encouraged at the 83 billion number that I'm hearing about commitments at this COP. Most of them are investment pledges. That's fine. But who will make those countries investment rich, investment green terrain that will attract that investment? Who will be actually de-risking that capital for them? There's a climate finance institute fund that does that. It's 8 billion. It has about $8 billion to play around with. That does a bit of blended financing, but 8 billion is a drop in the veritable polluted ocean. And we have let the scale of the crisis get so far and so complex that our fragmented, small, and really complicated responses are not really speaking to the needs, the growing, multiplying needs at scale of the billions that are being left behind. I'm really tired of the bumper stickers, just speaking over the reality repeatedly, and we keep investing in it. So I hope you're able to unpack some gold standard solutions because I have not seen any. The money is 100% out there in the private sector, but there is no regulation on the private sector. They are all housed in countries. They're all housed in countries. So please don't tell me there is no ability to tax or create funds from this huge private sector, which will not bring its investment as investment. It will only do so when taxed. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for setting the scene and the messages. I think, can you hear me? No? Am I loud enough? I, oh, okay. Yes, thank you. That works. So I think Senator Sari Rahman has already mentioned some of the keywords that I picked up. And when we speak about reimagining climate finance and action in South Asia, that I'm looking at the technical experts now on dais. Bankable, but not to expect bankable for vulnerable communities. Justice, how do we ensure that? Role of philanthropies, I heard it from ma'am also. Loans, how to avoid that, and while ensuring that we avoid all this, we still have a scale and capital scalable projects also. So we have a very strong panel, and let me introduce them. We have Mr. Thomas Kerr, lead climate specialist South Asia, World Bank Group Climate Change. Thomas, welcome. We have Yamit Dagnet, an old friend We have been interacting and we have been following negotiations for last many years. Director Climate Justice, Open Society Foundations. We have Dr. Abid Suleri, Member, Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change and Executive Director, Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Government of Pakistan. We have Ritu with Principal Researcher on Climate Change, International Institute for Environment and Development, and we have Dr. Rishikesh Ram Bhandari, Member, Task Force on Climate Development and International Monetary Fund. So we have financial institutions here, we have philanthropists, we have researchers, we have government representation also. So, Jameen, I know you need to leave at 4:15. We will request if you can stay for another 5 minutes, but I'll ask you two questions. One, the role that philanthropies can and need to play for when we speak about reimagining climate finance and action. Second question is, and follow-up question I should have asked you later, but I'm asking you already. How do you see the ongoing negotiations in the plenaries and meeting rooms? Are they capable to reimagine climate finance, avoiding debt, loans, and all that? Yamit, and then I'll come to Thomas.
Thank you very much. Do you do you hear me? Do you hear me? Yes? Do you hear me now? Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you and with this, among this panel. Um, I think the Open Society Foundation has started this climate justice dialogue, acknowledging that a lot of our missions for development, for human rights, would be undermined unless we do that. But if you put the hat of climate justice, the hat of justice really in it, what we decided to do is to really push for the resilience dimension, because most of the philanthropic organizations, have mainly focused on mitigation. So I am pleased to tell you that over the past 2 years, we have not only worked in pushing the boundary for ourselves in investing in adaptation and in loss and damage, including the whole ecosystem that made it possible to reach since last year, since last COP and this COP, the progress that we've seen, but also to bring others in. We know that alone we can go only so far. And last week, there's 11 and now 14 philanthropic organizations that made a call for action on adaptation, to recognizing that they are late in the game and they're going to do their homework. They didn't come with a pledge, with a target,
Yeah.
because we know that we need it to come in a very credible way. We need to do some homework. First of all, to look at how collectively we can come along instead of the individual parts that do not add up. So how we can come together, have a collective strategic framework, how we can learn, because hey, we cannot come just with a top down idea of what needs to be done. How can we learn and interact with the led heroes that knows actually where the solutions are? So creating the right platform to learn together, and then also and we know that a lot of more data needs to be generated. We need to to prepare our own transparency framework. So if we come in 2 years, like most countries will come in 2 years with their more ambitious national plans, then if we come with a target, we need to know the baseline and therefore how we're going to convey the progress. So I just wanted to tell you that this is in motion first. And of course, based on our experience, the minister said, senator said a lot about de-risking. OSF is a grant maker, but we also have an impact investment and others. So impact investments are different than commercial investment, meaning that we can look at the social dividend a little bit more. So not only look at return for investment. And we need to look at what type of projects and how, in a blended structure that we know is imperfect, we can de-risk sufficiently to allow the private sector, to allow other players to really chip in. But what we also learn is that if we bring grants together with private impact investment, it's better, because when it comes to projects, I think it was mentioned before. There's a lot of expectation that it becomes bankable. So, but we need to invest and to support the preparation of those, project preparation facilities, especially on adaptation. So that's an area that we are exploring, and to look at how to build capacity by having not only by relying on consultants, on experts, especially from northern countries, but to really mobilize not only experts from the regions, from the country, but even from the diaspora. So there's a project in particular that we're experimenting in the Caribbean, with the Bahamas, to do that. La, as another element is access. I think one of the questions for the loss and damage funds in particular is how to make sure that this fund is going to trickle down to the communities. And one of the reasons why we are not actually pledging, we can. There's an invitation for philanthropy to pledge. We're not pledging yet in the loss and damage fund, but we have already pledged for community-based loss and damage funds, like the sea level rise in the Pacific Islands, or even with the V20, who Pakistan is now a member. And the idea is to first get that fund co-designed by the communities themselves, including by the youth, and to really see how to test those mechanisms, and to make sure that it's not big millions, it's going to trickle down through smaller size projects. And last, I just would like to emphasize the role of key stakeholders like women and the youth in particular. I think there are stakeholders that we are engaging particularly with, but this issue of access, and also how to trigger, what will be the trigger? How can we be anticipatory? So the role of insurance, but not only that, cash transfer. And there's experience from area outside climate, like with COVID. So how can we learn from those other areas on how we can empower the communities who are the front line to react and to build that resilience?
Thanks, Yamit. I mean, in fact, I could identify one question for Thomas from here. So, Thomas, if that's okay with you, let's hear from Ritu, Rishi, and Abid Bhai. And then I think if we can look at World Bank to also answer questions that I could identify. Plus, I have a question for you, if that's okay. Ritu, principal researcher, IAED. I know your work on innovative climate finance. Will be good to hear from you. There are many various finance tools available, and we keep on referring them. But if there is an assessment, your own assessment on what kind of tools will be more effective, that can ensure what Yamid also pointed to, cash transfers or money goes to the communities. Ritu,
Thank you, Sanjay. Am I audible?
this mic is.
बिल्कुल मुंह पे.
हाँ, keep it close.
Mic is not actually, even when Yamid was speaking, I'll probably come
You
there.
come here.
Huh?
That's okay.
So actually, Senator Sherry really gave a very good opening, and she covered a lot of points that I would have actually made the context for. Basically, if you look at different countries, even with the same intensity of flood or a drought, different countries have different capacities to deal with that impact. And same within a community, there would be different individuals who would be able to deal with them or not deal with them. And very recently, we compiled a lot of case studies of non-economic loss and damage. And incidentally, one of them was from Pakistan, which clearly highlighted that during Pakistan floods, it was disabled women and pregnant women who could not be evacuated because clearly there's no DRR mechanism is set in place to evacuate them. So when we talk about climate finance and the support that countries really need, what do countries need? They need really diverse, uh, flexible funding that can be tailored to the specific grounded realities, the needs of the local community. Second, you need those funding mechanisms to be agile and anticipatory in a way that it can be provided even before the crisis strikes. Third, you would ideally want those funding to not just enable the communities to absorb the climate risk or bounce back, but bounce forward and go beyond the vulnerability threshold so they don't need the support again and again. And finally, you would want that this support to enable multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional, and also multi-level input or support. Is any of our climate finance, I'm not even talking about just the climate finance, you look at the humanitarian assistance, you look at climate finance, you look at DRR, you look at social protection, none of them are either sufficient or efficient enough to deal with all those four criteria that I listed. Taking the example, I'm sure that I've quoted that many a times, which is if you look at green climate finance, it takes about 5.5 years for an LDC to get accredited. That's an average time. Get accredited, develop a proposal, and get any kind of funding flowing into their country. And in those 5 years, the ground reality changes. And especially the way, like what is adaptation today becomes maladaptation tomorrow. So even that 5 year planning window, I would say, does not suit us at all. Again, a lot of other sources of finances, whether philanthropy, whether DRR, everything is governed by a set of principles, processes, and a lot of bureaucratic hurdles, which makes it very difficult for LDCs or any developing country to access that finance at its speed and the scale at which they need it. So what's the problem? The problem is with the very climate finance architecture, and the problem is that we have created the adaptation fund. Now we have the GCF, we have least developed country fund, we have green climate. Yeah, probably I mentioned green climate fund. You now have loss and damage fund. So what is happening is much of these finance is, you know they are governed by the mandate of the fund. This is adaptation, this can only be used for adaptation. This is loss and damage, this can only be used for loss and damage. So they are governed by the mandate of fund rather than being governed by the needs and priorities of the community and the countries where you need to invest that in. Second, many, like, what they do is, because, like, right now there's no loss and damage fund. So what funds do countries really typically tap into? They tap into DRR, humanitarian assistance. But many of these, by the very nature of this fund, they are very sectoral in approach. They don't allow you to work cross-sectorally. And as you see nowadays, with the loss and damage occurring, it's becoming a development challenge. Health is impacted, agriculture is impacted, education is impacted. So you need to mainstream it in every sector. And what you don't have is that multi-sectoral approach. Not because the countries are not capable of doing it. It is because the funds don't mandate it. What funds do? They create this artificial divide within the planning process. So, I was really like I was a bit angry with one of the panel discussion in another MDB. I'm not going to name the MDB, where they said it was a discussion about adaptation, and they were angry because I used the word loss and damage in my response, and they said no, this was only about adaptation. The problem is at the ground level, at the community level, do they really? Does it matter to them whether it is adaptation or loss and damage? So why create that artificial? Though this planning will only cover adaptation, this planning will only cover loss and damage. Rather, we should be focusing on comprehensive risk management. A comprehensive risk management that covers both economic, non-economic adaptation. Even when you don't implement adaptation efficiently, it leads to loss and damage. So why do we create those divides rather than focus on comprehensive risk management? And what we are proposing is, based on our research, we are proposing that the countries should develop, because we work on loss and damage. Again, probably we are creating that silo as well. But we are requesting countries, and we already have 8 countries on board, where we're asking them to create a national facilities. We were calling it national facility for loss and damage. But what we are requesting countries to do is to do that bottom-up decentralized planning, but a bottom-up planning of comprehensive risk management. And then at the national level, harmonize the governance of existing funds. Because what you've seen is 750 million being committed to loss and damage fund, which is like not even a drop. It would be bad to say drop because the bill runs in trillions, probably 2 trillion. So and these are all the big countries have already pledged. So you don't imagine, like you're not expecting any other big developed country coming in. So the point is probably the countries will need to what shall- others before me have said, probably blend it. And the blend is how efficiently we can bring together the humanitarian, social protection, DRR, and all of those finances together and see if, how they can use that existing loss and damage fund or GCF fund or other sources of fund in a way that they are able to fill that gap more efficiently. Of course, there'll be gaps still remaining because there's not enough finance on the table right now. And finally, and I'm sure Rishi will allude to that, even within we do a lot of work on debt relief as well, and we know, and we have a lot of data which clearly shows that every time a country is hit by a disaster, they are pushed into debt, and because the frequency and intensity of these disasters are increasing, these countries are being pushed to layer debt on debt because they're in a perpetual recovery mode. And we did this analysis on all the four indicators that IMF typically uses for debt sustainability analysis, which was on fiscal deficit, tax revenue volatility, the external debt, and all of those. And it was very clear that all of them got impacted by disasters every time a climate. What you hear is a lot of people talking about, oh, let's do debt swaps, let's do cost plus. But most of these are band-aids, like sticking plaster. They are not going to solve the debt issue of the countries unless you package it as a holistic solution. So you need layering of a lot of other debt relief solutions in order to provide that holistic support. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ritu. Excellent. I think I could identify a few more criteria for effective finance. Unfortunately, Yamid need to leave. We take a minute of pause, and if people would like to ask any questions specific to Yamid, we can take them now, or we continue the panel. We are still warming up with the topic, with the issue. But if there is any question on role of philanthropies as outlined by Jamil, and also how negotiations can strengthen or reimagine climate finance and action.
Can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Ritu.
So I'll just say, like, we keep saying that, this is how climate finance is not working, and clearly this is not working too. But like, this is how climate finance is not working. And I remember 2 years back when we started working on loss and damage, because it was such a controversial issue, none of the donors gave us bilateral
Yes.
donors gave us money.
Yes.
But it was only philanthropy money that came
Mm.
to us, and we allowed us to do. So, what role do you really see as a philanthropy organization to bridge that very important gap which is left behind the very
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Now we hear.
Yes. Okay. So what we have done is also to demonstrate how investing in the ecosystem, so movement building, even the capacity of negotiators, projects, illustration of the projects, and making sure that these investments is longer term, because very often some of the results take time. So patient capital, institutional building, data strengthening. I think this is what we've been investing, and this is what we are trying to demonstrate. So now those 14 philanthropic organizations have decided to do something on adaptation. It was not they were not yet ready for loss and damage, but over time I think that by demonstrating how we make the link, I really hope that it's going to be natural, for them, more natural, that they're going to do. One issue that is coming a little bit more is heat. So many of those philanthropic organizations are thinking about cooling system, investing into those cooling, making sure that it does not, emit too much. But hey, that cooling sector has, can have all those co-benefits, on adaptation. And then heat actually being a healthy issue is one of the most silent killer as well. So resulting in loss of deaths, loss of livelihood, which means this is loss and damage too. So I think there's a lot of awareness building, to really make those connections and bring more. And asset managers, pension funds are starting to come to us to see, hey, we need to also make our investment more resilient. So, hopefully we're going to create that resilience, but we need to continue to make sure that both vulnerable countries are equipped and capacitated to continue to voice and to push for the agenda, as well as civil society, without which we would not be where we are. And I would say, to answer to your question, what to expect from this COP, it unexpectedly and strategically bravely started with a good signal of global solidarity that was really important, but it's definitely, it cannot end there. There's a lot of work to be done to make sure that, the capitalization is going to actually reach the billions, that we're creative enough to really get the money and inspire ourselves with what's happening elsewhere, with taxes, with levies. And this is, especially for the most polluting sectors. And also to allow, when it comes to the question of just transition, to allow, as we go into the how, to allow true conversation that doesn't keep into the climate bubble. So this is where space for that, and this is where you're coming from, Thomas. Very, after me as well. But to allow for the issue of trade, the issue of debt, taxes, because some of the decisions made there, by others have unintended consequences. So I think we need to create those spaces and not to reduce the scope. And as Ritu say, we cannot keep being in silos. That's not how we're going to systematically transform the world we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yamit. Thank you, Yamit. I know you are running late, so thank you. Rishi, you heard about how that swap is a false solution, as Ritu, you know, it's not effective. Let's put it that way. Also, how climate finance could be uh, kind of a debt trap for countries. Also, would like to hear your views on climate and debt. Are they up?
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Is this audible?
You have to keep it closer to your mouth.
Okay,
Now it's okay.
great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel, and also congratulations to the government of Pakistan for really making sure that loss and damage was very high on the agenda, and for the fact that we actually have a fund with a governing instrument. So I think that was an extremely important development that I think all of us really appreciate. I would like to emphasize three things in my very brief remarks. First of all, of course, the loss and damage fund itself requires a lot more money. We don't even have $1 billion. But I think it's also time to really make sure that we take the loss and damage discussion and really embed that into the rest of the international financial architecture. And what I mean by that is multilateral development banks have to be very serious about loss and damage. This includes not just the debt pauses that we have heard, and of course, we've heard welcome news from the World Bank, but it also really needs to be expanded to include all climate vulnerable countries, not just 45. But it's also really important for the IMF to play a very big role. And here, in regards to the IMF, let me highlight two particular things. First of all, the IMF has a trust called the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. If you are a country that gets hit by a qualifying event, this particular trust pays what you owe to the IMF for around 2 years. It varies depending on the situation, but this is actual debt relief. This is not a pause. This is actual debt relief for almost 2 years. And this is the kind of ambition that we really need to make sure that countries can really focus on the immediate aftermath, really focusing on rehabilitation, recovery, and rebuilding efforts rather than having to worry about making sure that they are paying their debt to the IMF on time, right? But unfortunately, this particular trust has only 72 million, that's million with an M, in SDRs. Now, if that's the size of the trust, who exactly is going to be able to use it, right? So it's really incumbent on the IMF members to equip this trust to, number one, to be at the right scale, and second, for all climate vulnerable countries to be able to draw from this trust, not just, the only around 30 countries are eligible right now, but it really needs to be expanded to include all climate vulnerable countries. Second, in regards to debt, very concretely, the IMF has its surveillance tools whereby it really helps to monitor the various fiscal risks at play. And this is where loss and damage really needs to enter the conversation. And in the debt sustainability analysis that the IMF and the World Bank collaborate on for low income countries, loss and damage has to be a part of the math, because what happens is by not directly incorporating loss and damage, as well as climate investments more broadly, the implicit message that we're sending is that these things don't matter. So therefore, to make sure that countries are actually able to really think and reflect on how loss and damage, as well as climate change writ large, really impinges on their fiscal health and their economic well-being, we really have to make sure that the DSA tool really incorporates climate change in a very serious way. And finally, and this is what alluding to what Senator Rehman was mentioning, um, given where the interest rates are right now, in the United States, um, even the countries, in the global South with the best run economies, they are having a really tough time attracting private capital when you can get much higher returns just buying treasury bonds. And so this basic math is something that we really need to grapple with. And this is exactly where multilateral development banks have a very important role to play in making sure that they are able to supply low cost, long term finance in the best terms possible. And for this, the membership really needs to step up and really arm the multilateral development banks with fresh injections of money so that they have the right scale and the quality, right? The concessionality of the finance is also important here to make sure that these MDBs are really able to help support countries as they implement their NDCs and other various climate plans. So let me take a pause here and pass it back to you, Sanjay.
Thank you. Thank you, Rishi. Thank you very much. We heard various options. And Abid Bhai, Prime Minister's Member Council on Climate Change, from a country's perspective and a decision maker's perspective, how do you reimagine climate finance? If you also would like to share experience of Pakistan on mobilizing funds, I think 2 billion pledges were made in Geneva.
9 billion.
Huh? 10 billion, yeah. So please correct me, and I would like to hear your experience on that and also expectations.
Well, thank you, Sanjay. First thing first, the topic that we are discussing, it's not new. Climate financing and the demand for loss and damage fund, it goes back to 1991. It took us almost 32 years, rather 33 years to get that demand operationalized. You mentioned about Geneva pledges, and out of the $9.5 billion, so far what we have received is less than $1 billion. The reason is Pakistan was asked to be under an IMF umbrella in order to float bankable projects, and that's exactly what Senator Sherry Rahman was alluding to. Of course, if the super floods of last year, if we took almost 13 months now, more than a year, in order to prepare those projects, it means the emergency has converted into a new kind of emergency. And that was precisely the reason that many of the countries, of course not Pakistan, Pakistan took a middle position, but many of the countries, they were not happy with the parking loss and damage fund with the World Bank. My personal feeling is that after Ajay Banga's induction in World Bank has become more pro environment and more pro climate change compared to his predecessor. But loss and damage fund is operationalized, and then uh, we can say that it's our success. But then we compromised on three important pillars. The first, where this fund would be parked. Second, how much would be placed in that fund, no question asked. And third, who would be paying in this fund. So developing countries, they compromised on these three principles, and then they secured this victory, which was either take it as it is or leave it. And of course, taking it was sort of more rational choice right now. Now, the third thing, which is again important in this context, is rebranding and relabeling of funds. And many of you, if you interacted with the head of Global Adaptation Fund in B1, he was not reluctant to tell you that the amount which is actually committed for loss and damage fund is the amount which is deducted or which is less committed from global adaptation fund. So the pocket is same. You can call it adaptation fund, you can call it loss and damage fund, you can call it green climate fund or whatever the name. The money remains same. So if there is no concept of additionality, I think the additional vulnerabilities to which we are exposed to, that would stay there, and that would make us more vulnerable. And when we are talking of reimagining climate financing, my imagination of climate financing is, and especially if it's an emergency, uh, emergency is where the fund is readily available, where I don't have to wait for 15 months to get it materialized. It is the same thing that happened with Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka defaulted, and it had to wait for more than 1 year in order to get the bail package from IMF. And the whole purpose of IMF is to take care of the countries in distress, and especially who have already defaulted. The same is happening with Zambia. The same is happening with Namibia. I can go on and on. Almost 45 countries. They're facing the same plight, and we don't want climate change to be another distressing component where one has to wait for years and years and months after this climate disaster to get access to some of the funding, which is our right following the principles of climate justice. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Abhay. I'll go for to Thomas now. Thomas, some of the keywords or criteria or expectations, I'll list them down, and then I'll hand over to you. Uh, Tailored funding. We heard about agile and anticipatory. We heard about bounce forward, solutions that can bounce forward, multi-sectoral approach rather than silos. We also heard about a finance that ensures comprehensive risk management. We also heard about blending humanitarian, social protection, and DRR. Thomas. And yes, World Bank is also going to manage loss and damage funds.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. And I'm going to pick up on a word that Rishi said, which is the implicit message is this doesn't matter. You were talking about in the IMF policy. And I would say, having worked at the World Bank now for World Bank Group for about 11 years, I was at the IFC, the private sector side, and I've been at the bank now for 2.5 years. It's changing. And as you say, I think that it's a massive change in the past 2 years in terms of the focus on climate. And if you've been to the World Bank headquarters in Washington, as you walk in, it used to say, poverty and prosperity, and now it quickly changed to poverty on a livable planet. So somebody who, looks at these sort of symbolic changes, I think that just shows you that climate is now pretty much equal with poverty on the World Bank's priorities. So that's point number one. I think point number two is we are completely sympathetic to everything you said, but we are a big bureaucratic organization. We're a big bank. And the way we look at these climate finance issues are at a country level. Every country has its own unique environment. And so we have to kind of get into the weeds and get technical and understand what each country actually, what their economic situation is and what their climate risks are, and then come forward with a financing strategy. So to tackle that, we have recently developed a series of diagnostics, country diagnostics called Country Climate Development Reports, or CCDRs. For those of you who don't know, I really encourage you to look these up because it's a massive amount of effort to try to analyze both. What we basically do is we start with the country's development pathway. And so what are the sectors it's trying to grow? What are sort of the poverty alleviation targets? What, some of the issues, the resource it's trying to develop. And then we overlay climate impacts. And so we know much better now where climate is hitting them today, but also what it's supposed to be in the future. So we talked about heat on agricultural productivity, on floods in the urban setting and roads. And we look in very much detail of, okay, if you continue on this path, this is what's going to happen to your economy. And so you need to change that. In the bigger economies with an emissions footprint, we look at their decarbonization pathways as well. And then we overlay what the country's doing in terms of policy. And then throughout that process, you funnel out and you find, okay, for this country, these 3 or 4 are sort of the red flag risks. And these are the 3 or 4 green flag opportunities you might look at. So, obviously looking in South Asia, we've done these now for Nepal, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And in Pakistan, as the Minister, Sherry Rahman said, the estimate of 348 billion came from our CCDR that she gave. We quantified across agriculture, productivity, urban, and decarbonization. That's the price tag between now and 2030. And actually, the amount that's being delivered today is about a tenth of that. It's about $40 billion. And so then you get into this, what we've been talking about here today, which is how do you close that gap? And it really, there is no silver bullet. We do talk about the 3 buckets. So in that area, there is the domestic sort of policy landscape and domestic resource mobilization. So what are the sort of fossil fuel subsidy or carbon taxation, other sorts of fiscal policies we can put in place to send the right signals? Is there an amount of public finance that can seed fund some of these changes? But then really look at the private capital mobilization as a second bucket. And that gets into sort of having the right policy frameworks, but also, as we've been talking about, some of these financial innovations, so these de-risking tools and others. And that really gets, again, another layer of detail. You have to go into each sector and look at, for, let's say, climate smart agriculture, what are the specific needs, the viability gaps for these technologies, and where, is there a policy change that's needed, or is there a sort of a de-risking or financial tool that's needed, or sometimes both? And so we're doing, as part of these diagnostics, we're doing that. And then the third bucket is international climate finance can come in and be that catalyst. And as Jamid was mentioning, help to kind of seed fund things that can't be done by either public or private. And so, a lot of times the deal will be more attractive because the World Bank is part of the deal. So then a big international bank might come in and invest alongside of us. So it's a complicated picture. It's not an easy, there's no silver bullet, but I do think that these CCDRs are really helping to drive a different conversation around development and climate and keep them on an equal footing in these countries. And we are seeing some real interesting innovations come out. And the final thing I'll say is, I know carbon pricing or carbon markets isn't a results-based financing is not a silver bullet, but we're very bullish on building up the capacity of countries to recognize what their emissions reductions are in a credible way and to be able to monetize those in international markets. So, for example, in Pakistan, we are working with something the World Bank calls the Transformative Carbon Asset Facility, or TCAF. And what this does is we're working with Punjab and a couple other provinces to look at wastewater treatment, so biogas digesters, solar, and quantifying what the current baseline is and then what the emission if you replace them with cleaner technology, and then helping the country to monetize those credits on the international market. So, it's only a small piece of the puzzle, but that's one example where if we can replicate that in a bigger way, we can do much more. We recently issued the world's first carbon bond in Vietnam earlier this year. That was for a similar sorts of project, and it mobilized about, I think, $250 million, which is, again, a start. And so these are the kind of things, there's no silver bullet. I think if you build all these together sector by sector and really take from the country lens, what is needed, I think we can make a lot of progress. So those are my interventions. Hope this helps.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Well, we heard both sides. We heard expectations. We heard various ways to ensure that climate finance is accessible by communities. We heard the efforts being made by World Bank Group also, that how to address that as an issue from IMF also. Floor is open for any questions or discussions. I mean, now I think we can consider all the audience as part of the panel. So please feel free to share your views.
Sanju, you can rope in Bilal Nabbar, NDRMF, National Disaster Risk Management.
Bilal, we are looking at you. If you would like to come in, we are talking about climate finance and how can we do not hear from NDRFM. Yes, I will just draw my attention.
All your efforts to mobilize funds for national disaster risk.
Enough? Are they enough?
Well, well, talking about finance, nothing is enough, frankly. But on the other hand, I would say that um, a lot of kind of a new development is happening. A lot of innovative instruments are being played out and being experimented. So I think certainly it has opened up a kind of a new frontiers in terms of the finance, which we never actually thought about it. So internationally, I think this is very welcome, and it is kind of encouraging news, especially when we're talking about bringing the private sector capital into adaptation activities and adaptation actions. And even though it is very difficult because of the profitability is not there, and it becomes very hard for the private sector to justify their investment into it. But as an economist, I always kind of wonder that the kind of outcomes of adaptation and the value proposition of adaptation, how come the economic value has never been attached to it? And I think this is something work has to be done, or some research work has to be done. When it comes to NDRMF, we are actually opening ourselves up, and we are trying to bring and integrate new financial instruments and new sources of financing into our activities as well. Our work is predominantly disaster risk reduction, disaster risk financing, and bring us very close to whatever we do to adaptation. Although we are supporting on the mitigation actions for number of stakeholders, but our work is predominantly is adaptation work. So it is in our interest, best interest, that we actually look into those innovative instruments and try to integrate them into our work as well. We do understand, the conventional kind of semi-conventional funding is available, and it is coming towards NDRMF. But on a more sustainable long-term basis, we do want to actually look into those and try to integrate those instruments into our balance sheet. And so this is the work which NDRMF is actually carrying out and taking it forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Bilal. Any questions? Any thoughts? Disagreements? Ritojit?
Really internalize how important it is for climate resilience to be front and center alongside the range of policy reforms at the national, subnational, local levels that really need to reinforce those climate resilience interventions. It's going to be really challenging to really escape this debt and climate change vicious cycle that we often see in many parts of the world, and especially in South Asia as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Ali bhai,
It's just one question to Tom. There's another player in the climate finance space, and that is IMF. The difference between World Bank Group and IMF is that they look at macroeconomic stability, and you connect international finance, climate finance more with development. So at the face of it, we need both. But probably the adaptation is in the realm of development. So you have a track record of 60, 70 years of working in many countries in the realm of development, and in the last 20 years, slowly from DRR to climate change. So it seems that you are being elbowed out from the climate space by an organization that has no historical knowledge about climate change. Any reactions?
I think I was just saying earlier that IMF is also sort of changing very rapidly. I mean, they really are stepping up on climate change, and as I mentioned in CCBRs, I mean, there was supposed to be sort of joint diagnostics, and I think over time they will be, because I think they include this important modeling of sort of economic growth with and without climate impacts, and I think they're following us as we do this and coming up to speed. And all I can say is anecdotally, I hear a lot of people going from, they used to work in climate for the bank going to the IMF, and so there's some cross-fertilization going on there and expertise that's being built up there. But I think it's only moving in the right direction, but I'm sure it could use even more of a push. So I think more people should raise this and bring it up in forums like these.
Thank you. Any question? If not, I think let's give a big applause to the panel. Thank you, Senator Sherry Rahman, for actually putting very difficult questions to a technical panel, and the technical panel did come out with some solutions. Thank you, everyone.
Tree planting for us is a regular exercise that we do around the And to plant, there is a plant.
Group photo. Group photo.
To identify the areas that need regeneration, plan with the community leaders, especially the cultural leaders who are custodians of land and forests in our area. With this, we bring women's voices into this space of our planning to plant. As of November 2023, we have planted together with the women and the community.
Avisa public ribbon.
All right, thank you.